I'm here to share what I think of as a report from the front about new ways of thinking about really two problems in human evolution. One is the one that is in this title here, the oddity about our species that on the one hand, as represented on the left of the screen, we're exceptionally cooperative and tolerant, strangers can meet and have very pleasant interactions. And on the other hand, we have this tremendous capacity for violence. That's one kind of problem, the clash between those two things. And the other is about human evolution. How did we get here? How do we have a fine specimen of humanity, namely the president of Harvard on the right, emerging from a species that we might call Homo heidelbergensis on the left, represented, I don't know whether that's the president of Princeton or the president of Yale, but one way or another, we have this curious endpoint to human evolution that we're still trying to understand. How did we get to where we are today? The way I'm going to organize this is to first of all talk about the paradox itself. The paradox being that on the one hand, we are exceptionally violent, on the other hand, we're exceptionally cooperative. Then I'll talk about the two kinds of approach to understanding this, that we are very, I'm calling virtuous, very limited in our aggressiveness in some ways. How do we get that? And on the other hand, what is the role playing of violence in our human evolutionary past? And then we'll wrap that up and think about the evolution of Homo sapiens very briefly at the end. I want to point out that this is not a story about human evolution in general, because it really is a focus on males. So for the most woke among you, I apologize in advance for the fact that we will hardly mention females at all. This is a story about aggression, and the principal source of aggression in our species is, of course, males. And we see that in contemporary world. It continues to be a real bother to us, how on the one hand, mostly, we can organize our lives in ways that are very peaceful, but we can get these eruptions of violence that are so deeply disturbing, as in Kenosha here. So there's the paradox. On the one hand, exceptional non-violence, on the other hand, exceptional violence. Let's just look at these a little bit and see why it's a problem. The problem is that the ordinary way that we think about aggressiveness is on a single scale, that a species might be rather unaggressive, a species might be relatively aggressive, or somewhere on that scale from left to right. And if we have that single scale, we have the problem that on the one hand, we have apparently a tremendous tendency for reduced aggression compared to a lot of species. I'll go into this a little bit more in a minute. But this is the essential view represented by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The Rousseauian perspective is that we are born in a very unaggressive state, and that we tend to be corrupted by society if in fact we end up being more aggressive. And then on the other hand, there is the view that we have an evolved tendency for competition and violence and aggression, represented most commonly by Thomas Hobbes from the chaos of the English Civil War. In that case, you have the view that we are born in sin, as it were, and we are civilized by society. So those are the two views, and it's very difficult to see how we can be at both ends on the scale of aggression. But there is, in fact, a very simple solution that is amazingly taken a long time to emerge, and that is that there is not a single scale of aggression. There are two types of aggression, and they're represented here. There is the proactive and the reactive, the instrumental and the emotional. And these have been recognized for a long time in biology. They've been recognized for a long time in psychology, for decades. They're applied very usefully to children if you're thinking about problems in school. They're applied to criminal investigations. They're applied to psychiatry and psychotherapy. And we know a lot about them in terms of the way in which the brain controls aggression of these two types. And the two types are the proactive aggression, which is planned aggression. It's where somebody is not necessarily emotionally engaged, but they feel an aggressive plan that they design in order to achieve a specific kind of goal. And it may be to punish someone for wronging you. It may be to acquire something. It may be a moral wrong. You see it represented by various awful kinds of episode here, from lynching to genocide to killing a deserter. That's proactive aggression. It happens in animals. It happens in humans a lot. And then there's reactive aggression, which is where you lose your temper. There's a sudden initiation. A man comes back and finds his wife in bed with another man, and within seconds he pulls out his gun and kills maybe the man, maybe the woman. The aim is to get rid of this immediately provocative threat. And I've put in a picture on the bottom right of somebody putting their hand up as if to say, I don't want to get involved. And that's just to be a reminder that what we'll see is that reactive aggression occurs at a relatively low rate in humans. We have a low propensity for it. Well, back to proactive aggression. This is the type that clearly predominates in war, planned aggression, where one side plans to drop bombs, take out a machine gun nest, go on a raid into the neighboring territory. And that is where the source of most deaths come. In this figure, I've shown some of the data from various different kinds of society about the rate of death, the percent of population killed in war per year. And you see the four left-hand colors, the foragers, farmers, pastoralists, and industrialists, represent different societies. Each column is a different society. And you see a lot of range of variation in the rate of killing over the few decades that people were recording. But overall, it is quite high. And I'm going to show you what I mean by quite high in the next slide. But let me first draw your attention to the fact that the chimp range is in the similar range to the human ranges. Now let me show you what I mean by quite high. Look at these industrial societies. There are actually 5 there. One is so low you can't even see it represented, and the other 4 are lower than the foragers or the farmers or even the chimps in general. But the remarkable thing is that those include data for most of the 20th century for countries that went through both world wars. And it reflects the fact that even though we think of that as a particularly awful time, which of course it was in terms of the total number of people killed, in terms of the percentage of the population that was killed, it is actually not that high. The humans overall do have a very high rate of death from proactive aggression compared to any other species. And I think that comparison with what we clearly see as a high rate from the point of view of individual experience in the 2 world wars shows how high in general humans have been. And then there's reactive aggression. Well, here is a picture of some Ache hunter-gatherers, foragers in Paraguay, and they were studied by Kim Hill. And now it's 43 years that he has worked with them, and he's never observed them scuffling at all. Losing their temper to the point of getting physically engaged is a very rare thing in human society. And it's often something that will turn up in the news, of course, if people get into literally a physical fight. The situation is very different when it comes to chimpanzees. So what you see in this video is pretty intense aggression. It's the kind of thing that if it was seen in humans would probably get into the newspaper, but it's more of a daily occurrence in chimpanzees. And it just emphasizes a huge difference between ourselves and our close relatives. It's true for bonobos as well, by the way, that bonobos, the peaceful cousin of chimpanzees, has a rate of aggression still something between 100 and 1,000 times as frequent as humans when we're talking about reactive aggressiveness. So I think we can regard the paradox as solved. It's not paradoxical when you recognize that human aggressiveness comes in two forms. There's reactive aggression and there's proactive, and we have a low propensity for reactive aggression compared to our relatives, the chimpanzees and bonobos, whereas we have a high propensity for proactive aggression compared to most species, although chimpanzees also have a high propensity. Okay. Well, now what do we do with this solution? What I want to do is to investigate why it is that we have such a low propensity for reactive aggression, which is what I'm going to be calling virtue. And the key to the answer here, I think, is the concept of self-domestication. So our low propensity for reactive aggression, represented here by one of the most unaggressive animals I can imagine, the lop-eared rabbit, a domesticated rabbit, gives us the opportunity for individuals to interact together in a very calm way, to be very tolerant of each other, and to be cooperative, things which are really fundamental to the existence of Homo sapiens. And many people have regarded this kind of combination of characteristics as fascinatingly similar to domesticated animals. Basically, we're tame. We're tame in the same way that a dog is tame compared to a wolf. We have a low propensity for reactive aggression. The father of physical anthropology, as he is sometimes called, the German Johann Blumenbach, was the first to say explicitly that humans are far more domesticated than any other animal, but lots of people listed below have said this sort of thing in principle, that humans are like a domesticated animal. Now, interestingly, we can then move to thinking about the anatomy and whether or not human anatomy is similar to a domesticated animal. And the way to think about this is the way to how you identify the bones of a fossil or a domesticated animal if you are an archaeologist digging up bones in the last, say, 8,000 or 10,000 years. And the answer is that if you look bottom left here and think about the aurochs, which is the species of ungulate that gave rise to a cattle, you find a skull and you want to know, was it an aurochs or was it a domesticated one, a cow? And the answer is, look at these four characteristics listed above. Does it have a relatively light body? Is it got a short face and small teeth? Has the skull and skeleton been feminized with the males looking more like the females now? And has there been a reduction in the size of the brain? And if those things are true, as you see in the picture on the right, then it'll be a domesticated species, as in the modern cow compared to the skull of the aurochs there. Well, what archaeologist Helen Leach did was to observe a few years ago that in their anatomy, humans are like domesticated animals because when we look at the skeleton and skull of Homo sapiens compared to the ancestral species in the genus Homo, we see the same features. Humans have got, Homo sapiens have got a lighter body, shorter face, small teeth. The skull and skeleton have been feminized. And remarkably, in the last 30,000 years, we got a reduction in the size of the brain. Now, to put this in the sort of context of human evolution, here is a scheme to show the evolution of the genus Homo. So if you look at the bottom line, 2 million years ago, 2.0, you've got the emergence of Homo erectus, the first species of the genus Homo that could walk into a shop on Main Street and get clothes off the peg. It was the shape and size of modern humans, or in that variation, in that range of variation. And then you've got various species, and we'll focus on the ones on the right, Homo erectus becoming Homo heidelbergensis, and then about 300,000 years ago, you get the earliest species of Homo sapiens, the earliest members of the Homo sapiens species, identified by having a relatively short face, small molars, and a reduced brow ridge, which is a male feature that is now getting feminized. Here is that brow ridge, you see it as we move from left to right, from 300,000 years ago, maybe, dated on average at 315,000 years ago, this specimen from Morocco. And then you come to recent skull, and you see the brow ridge is largely gone. And the faces have become narrower too. And this is fascinating because it's a phenomenon that is associated with reduced aggression. Men's facial width, the width of the face in relationship to the height from the eyebrows to the upper lip, is correlated, it turns out, with aggression. And I put up a picture of hockey players here to illustrate this with a study of professional hockey players, as shown here, and in the same paper, a study of college hockey players, where you see exactly the same result as you see here. The result is based on the way that hockey players get punished for losing their temper. If they are too aggressive, then they are confined to the penalty box for a number of minutes by the referee. And the more aggressive, then the more time you spend in the penalty box. What you see here is the amount of time spent in the penalty box for 6 different teams in relationship to the width of the face, the relative width of the face. And some of these relationships are statistically significant on their own, and some are not. There's a lot of variation. You can't predict for any one man how much time he's going to spend in the penalty box based on his width of his face. But what you can say is that in general, the men with wider faces tend to spend more time in the penalty box. And this is just an illustration of the fact that there is this astonishingly persistent correlation with wider-faced men tending to be found to be more aggressive. As I say, if you personally are wider-faced, it doesn't mean that you personally are going to be more aggressive, but this is on average. So that's an example of a relationship between aggression and anatomy that is just very intriguing. Here overall are the human similarities to domesticated animals. We have a low frequency of reactive aggression. We have anatomical changes, in our case for 300,000 years, that have been similar to the changes that you see in domesticated animals. They are associated with reduced aggressiveness in animals and in humans, it seems. And then something I'll just very briefly talk about, we can now start seeing evidence that there are genetic associations with reduced aggression and the same anatomical changes. So here is an example of how we can get at some of these genetic changes. Domesticated animals have certain features that crop up repeatedly, not in every individual, but repeatedly. An example is the white toes and the white blaze that you get here in horses and dogs and cats and pigs. And this is rather the equivalent of the short face and small teeth and the reduced body size and the reduced brain size and the feminization that you get in domesticated animals compared to their wild ancestors. Well, this particular feature of the white toes and blaze is something that has given rise to an investigation of the genetics underlying domestication. Why is it that in these different lineages you get similar kinds of features emerging in the domestication syndrome, whether it's outside or inside the body? And the answer that is suggested by some, including myself, is that there is a change in the genetics of a very early tissue that appears in the very early embryo, the neural crest. And it turns out that when you have a genetic change that leads to a reduced migration of neural crest cells from the back of the body outwards around the body, then the ordinary pattern of pigmentation doesn't work. So this figure that you see here imagines the way in which the neural crest tissue, shown in blue, comes out from behind the spinal cord and then spreads around the body. it's an absurd picture because it shows it in an adult animal. It should be in a tiny little thing, smaller than a pinhead. But it's illustrating the point that the neural crest carries or moves around the surface of the body, and it carries all sorts of implications for the emergence of adult organs. Well, one of the things it carries is the pigment cells. And if you get reduced neural crest cell migration, either reduced speed or reduced number of the neural crest cells, and the pigment cells arrive too late at their terminal sites, in other words, the end of the legs, the end of the tail, the end of the face, and you get a white patch there because there's no pigment. Well, that's the kind of thing which is beginning to show a tie between the genetics of the neural crest and some features in the domestication syndrome. And here is another one, a gene called BAZ1B. It's on chromosome 7. You can see its per location in the figure on the right. And in a very recent paper, this has been shown that when you have reduced expression of this gene, it leads to a delay in the movement of the neural crest. It occurs in domesticated animals, not in the wild. It occurs, or these new versions of the gene occur in Homo sapiens compared to our close relatives, the Neanderthals and the Denisovans, whose genome is now being able to be looked at from fossil specimens. And in humans, there is a syndrome called the Williams-Buren syndrome, and they have this change in the expression of BAZ1B and is associated in their case with calm temperaments and reduced aggressiveness. So we're beginning to get a picture of a series of genetic changes that occur in domesticated animals compared to the wild animals, responsible for the tie between reduced aggressiveness and changes in the anatomy. The overall conclusion here is that we're dealing in Homo sapiens with a species that does not merely like a domesticated species in its behavior and like them in anatomy, but so like them, with the genetics coming to support this, that we actually are a domesticated species. And that means we have to be a self-domesticated species because nobody else did it for us. So we see this increasingly domestic-like anatomy for 300,000 years, signaling reduced aggressiveness, ending up with our lop-eared rabbit behavior today. So there's the picture. The idea is that the earliest Homo sapiens, seen at 300,000 years ago, are just beginning to show the kind of anatomy that becomes exaggerated as we come forward in time to the present day. And this anatomy indicates that that was a time when reactive aggression started to be reduced, and we would call ourselves the beginning of a self-domesticated species. So the great question about that then is, why? How would this remarkable event have happened? And that's significant not only in making us less aggressive, but also in producing the species that we call Homo sapiens. So here we got a 300,000-year-old reconstruction of a 300,000-year-old male based on the Broken Hill skull from Zambia. And the question is, what changed to make them self-domesticated? To think about this, I want to go to talking about the pattern of dominance that emerges among males in ordinary primates. And the answer is very simple. In every group of chimpanzees, or bonobos, or baboons, or macaques, all of these group-living primates, there is a single alpha male. And he becomes the alpha male by physically beating up all his rivals. He is helped sometimes by his rivals. He is helped sometimes by females. That happens in bonobos. And in bonobos, he is not necessarily dominant to all the females. He may be subordinate to some of the females. But in all of the primates, the alpha male is one who is individually able to beat up on his rivals. And I suspect that this would have been true for all of the species of Homo prior to Homo sapiens. At least we know that in Homo sapiens, it is not true. We don't have that alpha male system. Now, of course, we talk about alpha males in humans in a sort of joking way. But let's think about what actually happens with the dominance hierarchies of humans. On the one hand, you have small-scale societies, the type that we all lived in, our ancestors all lived in until 10 or 15,000 years ago. And in those, the relationships among adult males are described as egalitarian on the basis of the fact that there is no physical alpha. There is no alpha, in other words, who can individually beat up on all of the other males. He might try occasionally, but he doesn't get anywhere. And then you have state societies, and here we again have hierarchies. Now we do have hierarchies in which you can clearly say that not everybody is equal. You have a president, you have a king, you have a prime minister, but those hierarchies are not the result of Boris Johnson or Donald Trump or Juan Carlos individually beating up on the individuals below him in the hierarchy. He achieves his status by being political, by using coalitions, and then things become very complex. But the important thing is that we have a different kind of system from the primates. Now, I said that every now and again in a small-scale society, you do get somebody who challenges the system. They're meant to be egalitarian, but sometimes you get somebody who just throws his weight around, who might grab some meat that comes in when somebody has been working all day out in the bush and finally comes struggling home with the results of their hunt, and then this guy takes it from them. Or who bullies his way into taking men's wives, or who just makes them feel bad, or who kills men who get in his way. This has happened. There are many ethnographic reports of them, but the same thing happens every time. You try, as a society, to deal with it reasonably. They cajole them. They ostracize them. They ridicule them. Who do you think you are, big boots? They might try walking away, just getting up in the middle of the night and leaving. But of course, that's no good because the kind of societies we're talking about, people are very good at following each other and they can just never really get away. So if there is somebody who is disturbing the social calm in a really serious way, making everyone else feel bad and maybe being life-threatening to them, then there is an answer, and it's always the same one, and that is the ultimate sanction is execution. Christopher Boehm is the anthropologist who has done most to pursue this line of reasoning and observation through the small-scale societies of the world. And here is what he concluded. He said, the typical domination episode involves a male who seriously intimidates people at the level of lethal threat and then is dispatched by his own kinsman with the approval of the group. And the reason for it being the own kinsman is because if someone who's not a kin is involved in the execution, then there's a danger that there will be revenge killings because the kin feel kind of obliged to support their dead relative. Now this pattern is understandable in a world in which you don't have police, you don't have an army, you don't have a state, you don't have anybody to call on except yourselves. And if somebody is using their physical strength, their weapons, their loud mouth to make life appalling for everybody else, then there is ultimately only one thing that you can do. And the idea is this, that the regular application of execution to deal with the original kinds of alpha males that would have been there physically bullying their way to the top, the chimpanzee-like males, executing those individuals, now thinking about humans, would lead to selection against their genes. and their genes would be for reactive aggression. These were men who lost their temper when anybody challenged them. And this would lead to a domestication-like event. In 1932, worried about the oncoming threats in Europe, Einstein and Freud had a well-known correspondence. Einstein asked Freud, how can mankind prevent war? And Freud, in his answer, was the only person until very recently who suggested why it is that humans in general have evolved to be non-violent from a reactive point of view. The original state of things, he said, was domination by brute violence. And he was citing very new studies at that time of gorillas and baboons. And he was thinking of the way those males get to the top. And then he continued, the path that led from violence to right or law is that the superior strength of a single individual is rivaled by the union of several weak ones. That's what we're talking about. That's the way that an original alpha male in the very earliest stages of Homo sapiens could be defeated by a group of individually subordinate males, males who were scared of that alpha, didn't want to be beaten up by him, and they come together and talk about it and develop a plan to get rid of, execute that alpha male. And this is a unique feature in humans. And the thing that's unique about it is not that there is a coalition, because primates have coalitions. The thing that's unique about it is that the coalition is directed at a chosen target who is planned in advance. PACT, proactive aggression directed at a chosen target. When Caesar's assassins decided to kill Caesar, it took a lot to make sure that they were really agreed. And even when the event happened, they had to egg each other on. It takes a lot to have the courage for a group to kill an individually dominant individual. But humans can do it, and the reason that they can do it is because we have language. Sophisticated language, and it's got to be very sophisticated given the delicacy of the situation, enables us to float an idea with a colleague and say, you know, there's only one way to deal with this guy, and that is, let's get together and kill him. Chimpanzees can't do that. Chimpanzees can get together in small groups and kill members of neighboring groups, but then there's no decision about who to kill. Everyone knows it's the enemy. But in humans, they can decide that a member of their group is going to shift from ally to victim. And the important point about the fact that people can get together and plan the killing is that it means they can choose to organize the killing at a time when they have overwhelming power and the victim is totally undefended. Low cost, coordinated, lethal punishment, which still happens today when people are executed. So here you have, I think, the origin of social control by adult males, what Freud was referring to as right and law. And even nowadays, we have the same sort of thing occasionally happening. I don't know if any of you have come across this. There's a remarkable case of a man called Ken McElroy, who bullied his way to the top of a village, or a town, a small town called Skidmore, about 400 people in Missouri. And eventually he was killed in front of a whole bunch of witnesses, and no one was ever brought to trial because there was coordinated agreement. We don't talk about this. He had bullied his way, he'd taken people's daughters as his wives, he'd burnt houses, he burnt barns, he killed pigs, he shot 2 people. He was an extraordinarily unrepentful man, and the village decided, the town decided that there was only one way to deal with him. And I think what they were doing was going back into our past, as it were, to do it. So what I've argued is that the way to think about the mixture of human goodness and badness is that our goodness comes from our having a very low propensity for reactive aggression. Our violence reflects the fact that we have a very high propensity to use proactive aggression in a coordinated way if we think it pays, which it does in war, and it does in the context of executing those who make our lives miserable. And of course, what you see here is our capacity for proactive aggression being responsible for our reduction in reactive aggression. So thinking about this in terms of human evolution, here I would characterize an old view of human evolution, which is to some extent still true. Here what we see plotted is a measure, a likely measure of intelligence, which is the cranial capacity, this how much room there is inside the skull, plotted against time, coming increasingly to the present. And we go back to the ape-like Australopithecines between 2 and 3 million years ago, and then we start getting into humans, and we see a rise in the size of the skull. And many people have thought that this is enough to explain the evolution and origin of Homo sapiens, that the result of increasing brain size was increasing intelligence. And as we did that, we were able to make better tools. We had more cultural and civilized ways of organizing our societies, summarized as more brains, less brawn. So the reduced robustness, physical robustness of Homo sapiens compared to earlier species was simply the result of we don't need it because we could think of other ways to dominate our landscape. We didn't need to just be physically strong. And there may be something in that. But what I've suggested is that there's something very special that happens when you get language. And I don't mean the origin of language, because probably Neanderthals had some language, probably Homo heidelbergensis had some language. But when language became sufficiently sophisticated that individuals could whisper to each other some very dangerous thoughts about, hey, what if we tried to use each other to kill that ghastly guy who's taken our wives and killed our friends? When it got to that point, something happened. We entered a new, unique world where humans, for the first time, could cooperate in ways to kill individuals that were individually physically dominant to them. And then you get a lot happening. And here I'm suggesting that once you have that cooperation based on language, you can have capital punishment. It will lead to a reduction in reactive aggression. It will lead to us becoming like domesticated animals. And one of the ways in which that happens is that we become better cooperators and we become more tolerant. And out of that, we get what we would call modern behavior, which I'm thinking of modern behavior here as the behavior of Homo sapiens a long time ago, 10,000, 20,000 years ago. Increasingly modern as we come towards the present. We have gone on to do other things. Homo sapiens outcompeted all the other Homo erectus, Neanderthals, the Denisovans, all the other Homo have gone. We have diversified into a species that has colonized the whole planet. We even threaten to go into outer space. And that was all dependent, certainly, on our intelligence. But I think it also depended a lot on our ability to tame ourselves to the point where we didn't lose our temper so easily. We could cooperate and be a better kind of human. Thank you very much.